Alberta Premier Jason Kenney survived an apparent attempt to overthrow his leadership. At a caucus meeting last week, a number of MLAs spoke out against his leadership, but many others also spoke in his favor. With details, we're joined now by our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent of the National Post, Tyler Dawson, joining us from Edmonton. Tyler, Premier Kenney is now saying the United Conservative Party is united once again.
We will have to see how long that lasts. As you said, there was a caucus meeting last week, and there were all these rumors sort of circulating beforehand that suggested he was going to take a knife and that the caucus was going to bring him down. And of course, people will remember that this is how, it's gone for pretty much everybody. Ralph Klein dealt with this, Alison Redford dealt with this, Jim Prentice less so, but Ed Stelmach as well. Every conservative leader, it seems to have problems in their caucus. And as it turned out, they didn't go ahead with a non-confidence motion in Kenney's leadership. And, about 40 people spoke in favor of the premier. Of course, you take the 7 or so, maybe 10 or so people who spoke against him, and you have a 60-person caucus, of course. So you still have, sort of a wild card number of people out there. But certainly he has, lived through the day and survived that. Although I'm positive we have not heard the end of some of the internal caucus drama over his leadership.
So when Rachel Notley was premier with the NDP, did she run into non-confidence issues as well with her leadership?
If she did, it was certainly not a very leaky ship. I have no memory of her facing issues like that. I mean, I can think of a few times when she faced some sort of internal drama. For example, there was the sexual misconduct scandal that sort of rocked her caucus a little bit that I think was problematic for her leadership. But in terms of people, sort of fully turning on her and demanding she resign, I can't think of an instance of that in the time that she was premier.
Okay, let's circle back to Premier Kenney for just a moment here. And there is likely a leadership review of Premier Kenney coming up, I believe, next spring. Now, the timing is not clear, nor is the format, but some constituency associations are not placated and still want it to happen sooner rather than that.
That's right. So one of the outcomes of this sort of caucus drama was that Jason Kenney spoke to the party executive and said, I would like a leadership review and let's hold it in the spring. Now, everyone is sort of assuming that means it's going to be at the party's annual general meeting in March. But of course, spring doesn't end until summer starts, which is June 21st or something like that.
Right.
So there's a little bit of wiggle room there for the premier and his loyalists if they so desire. But the constituency associations have some power over all of this, given some of the sort of internal wizardry of the UCP constitution and laws and stuff like that. So there are still some people who are agitating, trying to get over the threshold of constituency associations that want a review to happen sooner, and that could potentially force a review to happen sooner. Whether or not they get to that threshold, whether or not any of those things happen, of course, is still up in the air. But at this point, we can say with, some degree of certainty that Jason Kenney is going to face a leadership review in the spring and perhaps even sooner than that.
But who would be strong enough to actually lead the party outside of Jason Kenney? And strong enough to, fight Ottawa or to face Justin Trudeau head on?
Exactly. And, given the timelines we're working on here, the other one is who's going to be strong enough to face Rachel Notley in the next provincial election. So there are some names that have been bounced around in caucus, perhaps someone like Travis Taves, the finance minister. There is also, of course, lurking up in Fort McMurray, Brian Jean, who is always a wild card in these conversations. Leila Gooderidge, of course, the UCP MLA up there, ran for parliament. So there's going to be a by-election for her seat. And it's all speculation at this point, but you could, depending on what the caucus and party drama looks like, you maybe could see Brian Jean come back. Of course, he ran for leader of that party against Jason Kenney at the beginning of the UCP. So a couple candidates out there, but yeah, you're looking at someone who needs to come out of the pandemic and straight into a provincial election, pretty much. And that's a big task for whoever takes over, if indeed someone takes over.
That would be something, absolutely. Now, there's a movement afoot, Tyler, in our province led by former Airdrie MLA Rob Anderson and independent Medicine at Cypress MLA Drew Barnes called Free Alberta Strategy. What is it all about and what do they hope to achieve?
It's sort of another iteration of some of the Western alienation Alberta independence stuff. Now, viewers of a certain age will perhaps remember the Sovereignty Association proposal that was in Quebec in what must have been 1995. And it's sort of similar to that. So basically, what they are proposing is that the Alberta legislature passes an act, an Alberta Sovereignty Act, I believe they've called it. And it would essentially say, we don't need to listen to federal laws. We're going to make our own provincial laws, and we're going to have our own provincial police force to follow them, and things like that. Now, of course, that would lead to presumably some sort of a constitutional crisis. But it is, I would say, notable because the Western alienation thing that we were all discussing, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, seemed to have really faded out during the pandemic, and this has now come sort of roaring back. And of course, in a couple weeks' time, when the municipal election comes around, there's going to be the referendum on equalization. So it's good timing, I think, on this group's part, to bring these things back up for conversation. But not to be too long-winded with you here, the other thing is that we just had a federal election, and we had the Maverick Party running on, a very sort of pro-Alberta sort of platform, and they didn't do very well. So it does sort of make you wonder just how high the wave is right now on Western alienation. So it's just another factor to consider in all this.
Tyler, some good news for the oil and gas sector, our energy sector here in the province. Enbridge's Line 3 will be in service soon. Now, it took 8 years, but the 1,700-kilometer stretch of pipeline from Alberta to Wisconsin will be carrying around 370,000 barrels of oil per day. Now, this is one important pipeline that Alberta was banking on.
That's right. So Jason Kenney and Energy Minister Sonia Savage were talking about this on Wednesday, sort of saying how important this is going to be for Alberta's recovery, and what good news it is for Alberta. And of course, you're right. There are 3 pipeline projects that everyone's sort of banking on. There's Keystone XL, the Trans Mountain Expansion, and Line 3. Of course, Keystone XL is dead. TMX, now owned by the federal government. Construction is ongoing on that. But this is, of course, Line 3 is going to be up and running by October 1st, which is a big deal for the energy sector, which has been dealing with these sort of takeaway capacity issues for, it's got to be two, maybe 3 years now, maybe even longer.
The province has put forth legislation that will ban protesters from blocking the entranceways at hospitals and other healthcare facilities. Now, it was all done under the Critical Infrastructure Act that was actually introduced in 2020. Can you really explain how it works and how it will help our healthcare providers?
So the act basically was created at the height sort of the protests and rail blockades and whatnot against pipeline construction. And the idea was that there's critical infrastructure in Alberta, and if you sort of blockade it or protest it, this act sort of gave police some additional powers to remove protesters. Now, of course, there are other laws that can apply in these circumstances, trespassing laws and intimidation laws and things like that exist in the federal criminal code. But this is, some additional provincial power. Now, what we saw a few weeks ago were protests outside of hospitals around the province, really, a couple of big spontaneous ones, and then, a couple others that sort of fizzled out. But there was a real worry that these protests were going to be really, really big. There were some reports of people being blocked trying to get into hospitals. We saw in Toronto, I think it was, where ambulances were struggling to get through. And so what the province said when these protests were going on was basically, this act probably applies, because it doesn't just say railways and things like that. It also says highways. And of course, any road is a highway. So if you're blocking a road accessing a hospital or something, that could count. But what they've done is updated the act and said that it specifically refers now to hospitals as well as critical infrastructure, which would basically give police the power to disperse such a protest were it happening in a way that was sort of interfering with hospital operations. So in that sense, gives police one more tool, I suppose, to keep access to hospitals open.
So with the Critical Infrastructure Act, Tyler, how will that impact healthcare workers should they go on strike?
Well, it's a great question because, of course, we saw when there was that random wildcat strike in Edmonton, it must have been 5 or 6 months ago now, that they were right on the steps of the Royal Alex Hospital here in Edmonton. And so there is the possibility, given negotiations between the province and healthcare workers, that there could be a strike. And of course, striking people tend to march in front of the business or facility where they work. So, it could come up then. I think there would be considerable backlash were something like that to happen. And I also suspect that unions, have sort of the legal and financial muscle to take something like this to court immediately were it used against them. But it is, just another thing to keep in mind when thinking about the way this act could be used in the future.
The Alberta Opposition NDP wants our province's Chief Public Health Officer to become an independent officer. Why is that?
They basically think that there's political interference in the decisions that are being made around the pandemic. That's one way to frame it. Of course, that's true. The Dr. Dina Hinshaw does not exist to create healthcare policy and implement healthcare policy. She comes up with policy, proposes it to the government. They may or may not take her advice. They may implement parts of it, ignore other parts, so on and so forth. The NDP, of course, is saying that that's not how it should be. There should be an independent panel of experts, and there should be the chief public health officer who's making these decisions and sort of circumventing the government. Of course, this raises all kinds of accountability questions, I would say. But they've been on a roll here lately with new proposals in the pandemic response. Another one being the proposal for a door-to-door vaccination campaign. So as we've talked about before, the NDP really working hard during the pandemic to come up with ideas and make the UCP look bad in the press.
Now, the Canadian Medical Association and a number of prominent doctors, Tyler, are calling for a circuit breaker lockdown with increasing COVID-19 cases here in Alberta, but Premier Kenney has outright rejected the idea.
It hasn't happened. That's definitely true. Now, there remains, of course, the possibility it will happen. We saw with the vaccine passports that the premier rejected that ever being a thing either, and then, of course, it happened. It's going to depend, I think, in large part, just how much worse it gets. On Wednesday, for example, Alberta broke the record for number of deaths in one day from COVID-19 at 34, which broke the previous record, which I think was 30. So obviously, hospitals and things like that still under huge strains at the moment, and there is the possibility that something like that could happen, I suppose. But you're seeing more and more voices. I mean, the Canadian Medical Association weighing in, I think, is a fairly big deal. You had a former chief medical officer of health weighing in this week. So certainly pressure is ramping up on the UCP to do something in addition to all the other things they've done to this point.
UCP MLA Tracy Allard is calling on the government to hand over surgeries to privately run clinics at the government's own expense. Now, the NDP is not happy about this, but would this not maybe free up some of the surgical backlogs?
It potentially would. So Allard made this suggestion in a long letter that she sent to constituents this week, and it prompted a furious backlash from the New Democrats who felt that it was undermining vaccination efforts and things like that. So it's sort of a strange. Well, it's an example of the NDP jumping on anything they absolutely can. But the one thing that did catch my attention in Allard's letter was this suggestion that you move some of these surgeries to privately run facilities at the expense of the government. There's no indication yet that the UCP is going to go that way, but certainly the delays in surgeries that have been made to sort of free up space for COVID patients is something that's on a lot of people's minds, and could be a move that the government takes to try and alleviate some of the political pressure on them. But very much remains to be seen whether or not that's something they'll do.
Tyler, the Alberta Teachers Association has shot down the kindergarten through grade 6 draft social studies curriculum, which has caused a little bit of drama. They say the curriculum is not suitable to even be piloted in schools.
That's right. So this is just the latest in a number of condemnations of the K-6 draft curriculum, which has been controversial for probably almost a year at this point. What the ATA says, they consulted some 6,500 teachers and other subject matter experts, is that it takes sort of too narrow a view of some of the issues, is weighted too heavily in other directions, and does not have sort of an appropriate breadth and scope for Alberta's history. And of course, this is one of those issues that just keeps dogging the UCP. It's been controversial for a long time, and the ATA coming out so strongly against it. You have to wonder how the government's going to manage to continue with this curriculum, because it's near impossible to even find a defender of it at this point.
Yeah. Our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, thanks so much again for your time today.
Always a pleasure, Hal.